It's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening to the Sunroom for this lecture by Mark Ellis. My name is Bev Thompson-Travis, and I work with United Christian Campus Ministry at Iowa State University. I'm United Church of Christ clergy. We have a format that we wish to follow this evening because we have such a brief time with Mark. And so we are going to ask that if you have some questions as we go through the lecture, please jot them down so that you don't forget as you go along through the lecture, because there won't be times during his presentation to raise your hand to ask a question, to interrupt his train of thought, but there will be ample time at the end for everyone who has a question to do that. And we want to be sure that we have questions from every perspective represented in this diverse audience. So as we move into that period, I want you to think about how you can frame your questions as briefly as possible so that he can be as thorough in his answer as we would hope he could be. I want to introduce to you now Sandy Johnson, who is our student president.
Good evening. My name, as Bev said, is Sandra Johnson, and I am the student president of United Christian Campus Ministries. On behalf of UCCM, I would like to welcome you here tonight. Dr. Ellis's lecture is sponsored by the Jewish Studies Program, United Christian Campus Ministries, the Miller Lecture Fund in the Graduate College, the Religious Studies Department, the Political Science Department, the Sociology Department, the YWCA, Ames United Church of Christ Congregational, the Ames chapter of the United Nations Association, and the Committee on Lectures. And now I'd like to introduce to you Samantha Kidover.
Mark Ellis is the university professor and director of the American and Jewish Studies at Baylor University. He's previously founded and headed the Justice and Peace Studies Committee at Maryknoll College of Theology. His most recent book, Revolutionary Forgiveness, contains essays on Judaism, Christianity, and the future of religions. It was published in November of 2000. After tonight's speech, we will be having a book signing and a little reception, so please stay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. I've had a wonderful day and a half in Ames, my first time to Iowa. I'm coming back actually in March, not here, but in Iowa. And I'm very pleased for the support that I've received from all of the organizations and departments on campus. Tonight I want to speak on the title, Jew versus Jew, a meditation on the Jewish Civil War and on the future of the Jewish people. My lecture tonight has 4 sections: labeling dissent, an evolving tradition of dissent, after the Holocaust in Israel, beyond dissent. Labeling dissent. At the beginning of October 2000, days after the historic visit of Ariel Sharon to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a visit which initiated the latest round of Palestinian resistance to the continuing Israeli occupation of Jerusalem and the West Bank, a female rabbi in the locality where I live sent the following email message to her rabbinic colleagues in the United States. Quote, "In Waco, we have a similar situation to Michael Lerner, though on a local, not national level. Baylor University, a Baptist university, which professes to want close ties to the Jewish community, has a professor, Dr. Mark Ellis, who is unabashedly pro-Palestinian. Things came to a head for us last week when he was the only Jew interviewed by any of the television stations about the Middle East. We are contacting the media to let them know that he does not, capital N-O-T, speak for the Jewish community, and that we consider this biased coverage Slanted news coverage is trouble enough, but to have so much of this driven by Jews who are in the media or get media attention is tragic. End of quote, or end of message. The rabbi's email is clear. She, along with the Jewish community, is for Israel. Jews who speak against Israeli policies are pro-Palestinian. Jews are either for or against Israel. Those who speak for Palestinians are, by this logic, against Israel and the Jewish community itself. Good Jews support Israel no matter what its policies are. Jews who dissent from these policies are hardly Jews at all. Now, this email message can be seen as a personal attack in a local situation where Jews identify their distinction from the surrounding evangelical culture in simple and negative terms. We are not Christians. That's one thing it says. And second, we demonstrate our connection to the Jewish world by identification with Israel and by policing Jewish dissidents and Christians who speak out on this issue. The subtext is that Christians who speak critically of Israel are anti-Semitic. The mention of Michael Lerner signifies a larger issue at hand. Lerner is known nationally and internationally as a progressive Jewish spokesperson and activist, founder and editor of Tikkun, a Jewish journal of politics and culture. How many of you have seen Tikkun? Okay, good. Tikkun was begun in 1986 as an attempt to counter the Jewish community's movements toward neoliberal and neoconservative positions on a variety of political and cultural issues. A central part of that rightward drift is linked with the increasing centrality of Israel and Israeli policies to American Jews, and an attempt by Jewish community leadership to discipline those Jews who are opposed to this rightward drift. The battle lines were drawn around this increasing criticism by some Jews and non-Jews as well, with regard to the seemingly permanent occupation of Palestinian land conquered by Israel in the 1967 war, and the expanding settlements around Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Palestinian uprising, beginning in December 1987, brought new debate within the Jewish world about Israeli policies of occupation and the violent repression of the uprising. It catapulted Michael Lerner and Tikkun into the national spotlight. In a series of strong editorials, Lerner castigated Israel and American Jewish leadership for their complicity in that violence, for their silence, and for their attempt to silence Jewish and non-Jewish dissent. Lerner saw the occupation policies of Israel and the brutal suppression of the Palestinian uprising as a betrayal of inherited Jewish values and ethics, and as a betrayal of a history of Jewish suffering, most recently in the Holocaust. Second section, an evolving tradition of dissent. Lerner was not alone. The pages of Tikkun were filled with Jewish voices that said no to occupation and to this betrayal of Jewish values and history. Lerner understood that a civil war between Jews existed. It would now be played out on the national and international scene. There were two combatants. Jewish leadership wholeheartedly supported Israeli policies. When questions were raised, they counseled and demanded silence. They would now be met by an articulate and growing number of Jewish dissenters. There was a rage in the early days of Tikkun that is memorable, a rage against injustice, especially when committed by Jews in the name of Jewish history. And there was a rage against Lerner and Tikkun's views by the Jewish establishment that can only be seen as a declaration of war. What was at stake was the history and future of the Jewish people. The civil war between Jewish leadership and Jewish dissidents began because two very different understandings of Jewish and religious life were developing, and because a politics that grew out of these understandings was highly contested. Here are the two different views of Jewish life in America. One sees America as the golden land of opportunity for Jews and desires to mainstream into the elite structures of the nation. The other sees Jewish history as compelling Jews to identify with those outside of the elite structures of American capitalism and questions assimilation to the state and to power. Now, Jewish dissent vis-a-vis Israel did not begin with the Palestinian Intifada or with Michael Lerner and Tikkun. At the turn of the 20th century, Zionism was a decidedly minority movement among Jews, opposed by most religious and secular Jewish organizations in Europe and America. Even during the Nazi period and after, significant portions of Jewish life remained either indifferent toward or actively opposed the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Opposition to a Jewish state as such was carried even by some Zionists. They opted for a cultural or spiritual understanding of a Jewish homeland. Three people I want to talk about in a minute: Judah Magnus, Martin Buber, and Hannah Arendt. They belong to those who understood a Jewish homeland within Palestine as important to a Jewish future. However, they opposed the creation of a Jewish state because they believed that the creation of a state would militarize this homeland and Jewish life itself. They had four main reasons for their opposition. First, to create a Jewish state in Palestine, the Arabs in Palestine would have to be displaced. Second, displacing Arabs in Palestine would mirror the displacement of Jews throughout history. 3, displacing Arabs in Palestine would also mirror the creation of religious legitimated states and the narrowing of intellectual and cultural life that accompanies such states. 4, a militarized Jewish state would ultimately be no different than other nation states. It is here that contemporary Jewish dissent finds its own traditions and rootedness. And it is here that a historical way of understanding the condemnation of Jewish dissent can be found as well. These three examples, some detail. Judah Magnus, first. An American-born Reform rabbi and spiritual Zionist. He was the first president of Hebrew University. And yet just before he died in 1949, he personally lobbied the United States Secretary of State Marshall and President Harry Truman not to recognize the recently declared State of Israel. He also recommended the presence of American soldiers in Jerusalem to prevent the division of Palestine. Who today, among ordinary Jews or Jewish leadership, speaks of Magnus's position? And who actually knows about them? Martin Buber, a world-renowned Jewish theologian, biblical scholar, and philosopher, was forced to leave Germany in 1938 and lived in Jerusalem until his death in 1965. Like Magnus, Buber was a cultural, spiritual Zionist. Like Magnus, he also opposed the creation of the State of Israel. Instead, Buber suggested a confederation of communities in the Middle East that would develop their own particular visions and way of life within a framework that encouraged a universal understanding of humanity. In the context of a confederation, a Jewish homeland would contribute its particularity to the broader arc of humanity. Magnus talked forthrightly with powerful figures in the United States government. Buber held a series of debates with Jewish politicians in Palestine and later in Israel, including a series of sharp exchanges with Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion. Buber's understandings, again like Magnus's, are largely unknown in the Jewish world. If known, they are dismissed as naive and utopian. Such regard or disregard for Buber's understanding by Jewish leadership is interesting. Buber was forced to flee Nazi Germany. He spent his later years in the increasing turmoil between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. Buber ultimately accepted Israel as an accomplished fact, and from there he argued his positions within a Jewish context where he was often vilified, and where his ideas had consequences for Jews in the land, for him, and for his own family. Is it possible to ignore his witness as utopian when he lived through and within the two formative events of contemporary Jewish life, the Holocaust and the formation of Israel? Hannah Arendt, herself a refugee from Nazi Germany, Hannah Arendt spent a significant part of her adult years organizing Jewish relief efforts and was one of the first intellectuals to write of the tragedy that befell European Jewry. Her own writing included two of the major and most controversial books written about the Holocaust before the subject was considered worthy of academic consideration. Like Magnus and Buber, but from a more secular perspective, Hannah Arendt was a binationalist on the question of Palestine. She also thought that the Holocaust had to be analyzed in historical and political terms. Her reporting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in the early 1960s was deemed insufficiently condemnatory of the evil intent of the Nazi regime. This part of her work was chastised rather than forgotten. The campaign of vilification against Hannah Arendt stands as the quintessential attack on a person's Jewishness rather than dealing with the Jewish tradition of descent, which she embodied and distinguished. It's interesting that Gershom Scholem, the great Jewish scholar also from Germany, who later settled in Palestine then Israel, accused her not of distorting the facts, but of not having a love for the Jewish people. But we need not identify those who have left a record of achievement and notoriety to witness the survival of the Jewish tradition of dissent in our time. Since the creation of Israel, there has been a variety of dissenting actions and speech that addresses the hopes and aspirations of the Jewish people to end the cycle of violence and atrocity. This seems natural. Haven't Jews suffered from the violence of religion and nationalism? One thinks here of the soldiers under Yitzhak Rabin's command in the 1948 war, who, educated in, quote, cosmopolitan ways, refused to cleanse Arab villagers from areas that would become part of the new Israeli state. By the way, Rabin wrote about this in his memoirs, censored in Israel by the government, published in the United States. He said there were soldiers raised in cosmopolitan ways who would not follow my orders to cleanse Arabs from their villages. They need to be re-educated. These same soldiers, seeing Palestinians being displaced and forced across the borders, remembered the Jewish exile from Spain as an image which they glimpsed within the Palestinian catastrophe. That is, Jewish soldiers If you look at their diaries, when they saw Palestinians being cleansed, they remembered episodes in Jewish history when we had been cleansed. The record of dissent continued during the Israeli bombing of Beirut in the 1980s, when some Israeli soldiers refused to serve in Lebanon. It accelerated during the Palestinian uprising, when other Israeli soldiers saw in the policy of might and beatings images of Nazi brutality once carried out against Jews. I want to relate 3 stories to that effect. When you look at the literature, they're all over the place, and I record these stories, some of them, in a book I published in 1990 titled Beyond Innocence and Redemption. The first story is at the beginning of the uprising, when the Israeli government, Secretary of Defense Rabin, ordered soldiers to break arms and legs of Palestinian protesters so they would heed the lesson not to continue with the uprising. And they took a group of Palestinian teenagers from a village out into a field and beat them with wooden clubs so fiercely that the clubs broke. But one was left with his legs unbroken, only his arms were, to go back to the village to make sure that everybody knew what would happen if this uprising continued. The title of the article published in Israel was The Night of the Broken Clubs, obviously a play on the Night of Broken Glass, 1938. Marcus Levin, a Jewish Israeli physician, was called to Anzar 1, a prison camp for Palestinian resistors, and when he asked what he was to do as a physician, a person in leadership said, "Oh, it's no problem. You simply attend to the Palestinian prisoners if they have broken arms or legs after their interrogation." Levin said, "I am not Joseph Mengele, and I refuse to do such things," referring to Mengele as a physician in the Nazi camps. And the title of that article, again published in Israel, "I Refuse to be a Mengele." Finally, Irina Klepfish. Her father was one of the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, died in that battle trying to save another Jew. She was asked to deliver an address on the 50th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Obviously, most of the people in the audience were Jewish. And what she said was that her father's sacrifice was not because he thought they could win in the Warsaw Ghetto, no. But it was for the dignity of Jews, that we had a right to fight and to be free. And she very bravely then said, "This is what I see in Palestinians who are rising up for their freedom." These articles and stories note that a transposition has taken place in Jewish life. Were Jews, in denying the rights of Palestinians, acting like those who had denied Jewish rights across the millennia? This is what I call in Jewish history the liturgy of destruction. Many times in Jewish history, people have assaulted us and even recently tried to annihilate us. And if you look at the way we recite history, it really is more liturgical than a linear historical model. And when Elie Wiesel speaks about the Holocaust, you're not going to get fact after fact. You really have a liturgical moment, haunting moment. What these people are seeing without any agenda is the broadening of that liturgy of destruction and realizing that now Palestinians are part of that liturgy and therefore intimate to our history. It continues today, of course. If you look at Noam Curzon, no doubt a secular Jew, who was in the Israeli Defense Forces and then was going to be put in the West Bank to quell the new uprising, Noam Curzon simply refused to get on the bus and was jailed. It's interesting how people refusing to get on buses have a historical importance. And if you look at the other Israel, edited and written by Adam Keller, a very interesting Jewish Israeli, he's just sent out what is about a 40-page, day-by-day recitation of what's been happening in this Palestinian uprising now, and what his response is, and some other Jews are responding. And I read that a lot like Ringelblum's Warsaw Diaries, where he doesn't talk about theory or theology, but just lays it out day by day what has been happening to Jews. Section 3, after the Holocaust in Israel. The tradition of dissent has grown over the years. At the same time, Jewish leadership has become increasingly accepting of Israeli policies which, at different times in the last decades, have shocked the Jewish world. Just two. 1987, 1988, those initial TV pictures of the policy of might and beatings, where many Jews in America, for the first time, saw what has happened to many Palestinians before that and after. It shocked the Jewish world, and Jewish leadership said, don't be overwhelmed by it. We'll get through this. Don't get alarmed by it. And then just recently, helicopter gunships. Helicopter gunships hovering over Ramallah, but not only, firing rockets into Palestinian cities, towns, villages, and refugee camps. And the response is full-page ads in the New York Times for Jewish unity. The recent Palestinian uprising, Intifada II, or the Alaska Intifada, has raised the stakes significantly. The initial reports of Israeli tanks and helicopter gunships surrounding and menacing a defenseless civilian population brought a new realization of the ongoing campaign to demean and destroy the Palestinian struggle for dignity and statehood. This comes after almost a decade of peace talks, the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, whose implementation has been constantly delayed and violated, the Rabin assassination in 1995, the Netanyahu government that followed, and the crumbling Barak government that speaks peace, expands settlements, makes more refined and intricate map of bypass roads and encirclement of Palestinian towns and villages, delays troop redeployments, and now unleashes the forces of Israel through helicopter gunships, assassination squads, and the closures of towns and villages. This second uprising comes within this failure. It has raised the consciousness of Jewish dissenters and the rhetoric of Jewish leaders, Jewish dissenters. Even those dissenters like Michael Lerner, who accepted Oslo and rebuffed those critical of that agreement as too limited and unjust, have emerged in the shattering of Oslo with a new, stronger voice. Rather than policy implementation, Lerner now speaks of witnessing to values in the Jewish tradition, values that are being systematically violated. He writes recently, "We want the world to know that in this dark period, there were Jews who stood up and proclaimed their commitment to a Judaism that would fight for a world in which every human being is treated with respect and the sense of sanctity that are central to a spiritual vision of the world." End of quote. Jewish leaders, full-page advertisements from major Jewish organizations have been appearing almost daily in the New York Times and other newspapers. They call for Jewish unity in the face of Palestinian aggression and Palestinians' refusal to accept the, quote, offers of the Israeli government for a final settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Arafat is depicted as a warmonger who places children in harm's way. The bullets they receive from Israeli soldiers are blamed on the Palestinians themselves. Two sidebars. Wars are always fought by children. Right? In many countries, 13, 14, 15. In our country, it starts at 17, 18. But wars are always fought by the youth. Second, recently, a few days ago, several Palestinian collaborators were executed. Horror. But if you look at Isaiah Trunk's book titled Judenrat, The Jewish Councils of Nazi Germany, what do you think happened in the Warsaw Ghetto to Jewish collaborators? They were executed. Of course, in these calls for Jewish unity, the use of helicopter gunships is never mentioned. Nor are the closure of towns and cities, or the use of Israeli control of electricity and communication, of water and movement of people as weapons of war. Israel is depicted as offering everything, as giving up power and authority. And the map of the final settlement offered by Israel is systematically distorted. In fact, if you look at the map, Israel takes almost everything in terms of territory, except where large concentration of Palestinians are located. Israel and its military and its settlers cut through this land so that Palestinians and Palestinian territory is surrounded by Israel and Israeli power. Why do you think Israelis can shut these towns and cities and villages off like that? Because they're shot right through and around. If you look at the map of Israel as it exists in Israeli power, you see a Jerusalem annexed but expanded 10, 20 times what it was. That's not going back. You see corridors over the green line of the 67 borders, which are reserved for Israeli military, and in the Jordan Valley, so they're on both sides of the Palestinians. You see bypass roads and settlements that further slice through and around Palestinians. You have, in fact, Israeli control of the land from Tel Aviv to the Jordan River, and you have two remnant Palestinian populations in between. You have the first remnant that stayed within the 67 borders of Israel. That is, they were not expelled, they did not leave. And now you have on the West Bank another remnant, and it's all surrounded by Israeli power. Jewish dissent, though, is in a bind. For many years, dissent tied itself to Jewish innocence. Jews were innocent in suffering and in empowerment, in the Holocaust and in the creation of the State of Israel. Zionism is something good, the national liberation struggle of the Jewish people. Israeli policies are sometimes wrong. These specific policies are aberrations and must be opposed. The opposition to certain policies is to bring Zionism and the Jewish state back into line, in a sense to recover Jewish innocence. That has been the basic tone of Jewish dissent. So the scenario is as follows. Jews suffered in the Holocaust, thus the creation of Israel. The creation of Israel is a good. Rejected by the Arab world, Israel fought defensive wars for its creation and survival, the wars of 1947, 48, and 1967. After the 67 war, a temporary and benign Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza came into being, which over time became semi-permanent. This occupation became increasingly harsh and needed to be criticized. In the late 1970s and early 80s, Lebanon became a base for Palestinians and a target for Israeli incursions and ultimately an invasion. The bombing of Beirut especially was unacceptable, and the entire dissenting community was mobilized to oppose the first of Israel's wars that was clearly neither for defense nor survival. The occupation continued, and the first intifada beginning in 1987 was clearly to establish a Palestinian state alongside Israel. This was brutally crushed by Israel, like the invasion of Lebanon. Jewish dissenters saw this repression as abhorrent and still an aberration. Then came Oslo and the chance to rectify past injustices and end the ever-increasing aberrations of Jewish behavior. The years after Oslo brought further disenchantment, and today the argument for Jewish innocence, even a distant return, is no longer heard. Jewish dissent is in a bind because it's been arguing for Jewish innocence, and everything that Israel has done has been an aberration. But the aberrations continue. So you have to ask, how long is an aberration an aberration? It's like anti-Jewishness in the Christian tradition. You know, I love when Christians say it's an aberration. It's one of the longest aberrations in history. The Jewish establishment and Jewish dissenters have been arguing over the same turf: Jewish suffering and Jewish empowerment as innocent. Jewish leadership simply proclaimed this innocence as self-evident. By the way, because Jews don't do things that are bad. That's the Jewish establishment's view. Jewish dissenters want to recover innocence. Forgotten by both sides is an initial dissent that did not discuss Jewish innocence per se, or even claim a right to a homeland uncontested by another people. In the emergency years, these were the difficult years of the post-Holocaust world, Magnus, Buber, and Hannah Arendt saw a need for fraternal bonds between Jews and Arabs in a changing Palestine. Whatever the claims of either people, they envisioned a mutual, interdependent empowerment. Now, it's true, these dissenters were Western in their orientation and colonial in their mentality. Buber, Magnus, and Hannah Arendt all thought that the Arabs needed the Jews, primarily because Jews were Western. And so it was a colonial mentality about the West coming to the East. Still, the anti-status views of the early dissenters are important for this evolving tradition of Jewish dissent. Remembering, Magnus, Buber, and Arendt lived before and through the Holocaust and the creation of Israel. Their views of both events were informed by the before and after of contemporary Jewish life, before the Holocaust and after, before the State of Israel and after. Their views of the choices before Zionism and the consequences of those choices were prophetic. For them, the state itself, Israel as a Jewish state, was a recipe for disaster because of what of necessity ensues from the formation of any state. They didn't think that putting Jewish before a state changed the nature of a state. If the raison d'etre of Jewish life in Palestine became the creation, maintenance, and survival of a nation state, the very reason for a Jewish homeland, renewal of Jewish culture and language, social, political, and cultural experiments in the post-war world, hope for the survivors of the Holocaust to find a life of peace and harmony, the revival of an ancient religious community in its particularity, but with a universal message, all of this would be destroyed. And we must say that Jewish dissenters today come after the Holocaust and after the formation of Israel. We as Jews today do not simply come after the Holocaust. We come after the Holocaust and Israel. Now, Jewish dissenters have experienced the consequences of statehood, but have been unable to articulate this clearly and boldly. They keep talking about innocence. The question is, why? Why can't Jewish dissenters see clearly and state it clearly? The reason seems to be a fear of being seen as outside the Jewish world, or even against it, and therefore against one's own Jewishness. That's the email that I quoted from in the beginning. Israel as a nation state thus becomes the litmus test for Jewish loyalty and Jewish empowerment, again in the form of a nation state. And that is the religious and ethnic test of Judaism and Jewish life. It has its own logic. Questioning the Jewish state is a sin. Questioning its policies is the borderline of sin. At some point, criticism weakens Israel and makes it ripe for those who seek to destroy Israel and Jews within the state. Looming on the other side of this border is another Holocaust. And so the stakes are raised beyond individual sin to a betrayal of a community. This is the logic of the argument. Clashing with the Jewish state is therefore to court the possibility of being responsible for a second Holocaust in which millions of Jews will die. So the calls for Jewish unity are thinly disguised pleas to prevent a second Holocaust. And if you're Jewish, criticizing the state, you're not only encouraging another Holocaust, you're encouraging it as a Jew. That's the logic. Now, if you accept this logic, it's impossible to push to the ethical conclusion that seems obvious. This is why so much of Jewish thought is skewed today. It's not that Jews are less intelligent than they were when they saw clearly. It's because we've had to skew our arguments within this logic. For if Israel, like any other nation state, is not innocent, by the way, not less innocent or more culpable, but the same, if its own trajectories have less to do with an ancient tradition and the pursuit of an individual and corporate ethical life, if it can, again, like any nation state, only use religion and religiosity for its own purposes, then calling Israel to its Jewishness is a lost battle. Its Jewishness can only be dimly perceived as traditional and worthy of discussion in a spiritual way. The Jewishness that can be affirmed, the Judaism that is presently practiced in Israel and among Jewish leadership, is reminiscent of the ties that Christianity has had with nation states after it was elevated from a persecuted sect to a state religion. That is Constantinian Christianity. Now, Constantinian Christianity links church and state in the religious arena and in the intellectual and political world. Constantinian Christianity was a new form of Christianity that developed in the 4th century and beyond. It featured a collusion of church and state. Christianity moved from the margins to a state religion and blessed the state and got its perks from the state. It transformed its witness to legitimation of the state and its policies in return for its elevation to respectability. By the way, in Europe, in many parts of Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, we really were not very well respected before the Holocaust. Now we're supremely respected. The text of the Christian tradition and the symbolism of its deepest impulses remained, but a new religion evolved, which used the subversive message of its early years as a cover for policies and the development of an orthodoxy that would have scandalized the early followers of Jesus. The Gospels were still read. The church services were just the same. It's just that outside, people were being beaten over the head with that message. Certain arguments for Christian life, including its suspicion of the state and military, dropped away and were even turned around to an embrace of these arenas. And what happened to Christian dissent? It was squashed. And if it was so powerful, it had to be taken in. By taking it in, it was transformed into something else. Therefore, when I first went to Rome in 1973, I saw across from the Vatican St. Francis Banks. It's a chain of banks in Italy, St. Francis's banks. Okay, that's what happens. Okay. Now, many Christians have woken up to this Constantinianism and flee it like a person flees a burning building. But we as Jews have embraced it. In fact, in my lifetime, we have seen the development of a Constantinian Judaism in service to the state and to power. Okay, there are differences. Christianity is global. It has a history of atrocity that is so long I don't have enough time to even outline it. Ours is small. It is not global. And it's minuscule in terms of the time because it's new. But it's had its effect on Palestinians and on us as Jews. The comparison of Constantinian Christianity to Constantinian Judaism is instructive. Its arrival brings to an end the ethical precepts of any tradition. It embroils the religion in legitimation of state policies that should be opposed. The elevation of that religion produces a leadership that will persecute its own contemporary prophets, even as it holds up ancient prophets as part of its contribution to the world. In the end, and this includes Constantinian Islam or Constantinian Hinduism, so all along the board, Constantinian defines a religion, and the particular symbol structure means little. Constantinian Judaism and Constantinian